Monday to Friday.
I have seen the face of God.
You just might be right, Mr. Just might be right, Mr.
Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. Any better? Let's boost it up a little bit. Try that. Yeah, give us a nod in the chat if mic levels are okay there. Look a little bit low. Don't know why that should be. Might just have to tweak a few levels. Just a little quick potted introduction. I'm still desperately trying to deal with my stage nerves and organisation for the show back here just yet. Zebras and donkeys, bifurcation and why you should give a damn about it. Human despeciation is going to be the topic of tonight, because I think it's a primary consideration if it could possibly be true. So let's explore those possibilities. Anyway, going to refresh me teacup here, because you know it has to be brimming before I can start talking. And here's a tune that's particularly applicable for tonight's subject: Every Kind of People, Robert Palmer.
Make the world go round.
A fabulous Robert Palmer there with Every Kind of People. Yeah, so first the disclaimer: this is the Freeman Jack Show. We'll be discussing adult topics with potentially adult language. If you're easily offended, please feel free to use the off button. Any opinions expressed in tonight's show will in no way reflect on the radio station or any opinions held by any other hosts. That's what the exclamation mark is supposed to indicate. Beware, look out, alert, caution. So, twisting some minds. Has the human... You would, wouldn't you? Oh, I see, and just turn around and piss off again. Sorry, the dog. Typical. Tell everybody in the house, don't disturb me, I'm on air. The dog and a closed door, she abhors a closed door. She'll sit and cry on the far side of a closed door until it's opened. Go into the room, turn around, walk out, and that'll be fine. The door's open now. Nothing to worry about. Mastiffs. Right, okay, where was I? Human despeciation. Has the human being, as we know it, reached a point of bifurcation, as it's known in biology, of branching? I suspect that it has, and I would like to propose that and some of the implications of that, should it be so. First of all, we've been bombarded in the latter part of the 20th century and the early 21st century with the geneticist's model of biology as being gene-oriented. Now, I'm very familiar with the terminology and theory of genetics. I think DNA is probably one of the most closely studied molecules ever to be known to mankind so far. My eldest son is currently studying to be a geneticist, so I do understand these matters. However, as an agriculturalist, as a horticulturalist, as a plant husband, I have learnt through very close and careful observation that genotype is only the guide. Phenotype is actually the king in the natural system. Phenotype is the environment. Genotype is the nature, is the predetermined nature. Now, through the study of genetics, phenotype is now being understood to have quite a serious impact over genetics. The direct transmission of a parental set of genes from parent to offspring is not as straightforward and as linear as the original inquiries would have led the geneticists to suspect. Indeed, there are any number of lesser genetic sections of code, shall we say, that are not firmly switched on or off, that they are deterministic bits of code that, determined by the particular environment that the offspring finds itself in, will dictate whether or not that particular codon is switched or not. As a consequence, any parent or any set of parents that experience a markedly different phenotype environment, i.e. the food that they eat, the water they drink, the hours of daylight, the chemical environment, their workload, their stress loads, all of these things can be considered as a phenotype pressure and as a pump that is driving genetic adaptation far more so than was previously assumed. And as a consequence, parents can actually pass on minor genetic adaptations from their environment to their offspring, and their offspring can then pass those on to their offspring. So the human genome is far more variable than one might suspect, and even down to things like determination of race. A hugely contentious subject, which I feel that can be entirely defeated by a simple analysis of I believe it was a Venetian population of black Africans. Now, the vast majority of the study of populations of black Africans outside of Africa have been those black Africans who were supposedly traded there as slaves, and whose histories and sort of phenotype environments will be radically different to these Venetian Africans. During the sort of late Middle Ages, the north of Africa began to get rich off of its trade with Europe, and consequently several families of black Africans upsticks and moved to their sort of trading centre, which was at the time Venice. I could be wrong with the town, but it's one of those coastal towns in that sort of crook between Italy and Greece. They basically intermarried for several generations and established themselves as a local group, but they maintained their local African religious traditions, which weren't that far dissimilar to the local Italians, but they kept themselves to themselves as a group. They were incredibly wealthy and were, landed and propertied in Italy and that. Anyway, come 16 something or other, I believe it was, maybe a little earlier, old Popey in the Vatican decides that all of these Africans getting rich off a trade with Europe had to stop. And so he passed a papal bull banning all trade with African nationals of black Africans. I don't think it was necessarily a racial bar, but it was to prevent trading with the north of Africa, and so to push the trade that was coming across the Mediterranean around the land routes that they had better control over. Anyway, because this population of black Africans that was now segregated by the severing of transport links with their sort of familial contacts on the African mainland, carried on with their practice of intermarrying and just carrying on as normal. They were wealthy enough that they were able to convert their assets to financial dealings on the European mainland. And the thing is, because this was a staunchly Catholic country where all births, marriages and deaths were carefully recorded in the local church's sort of documentation, and because these families were so incredibly wealthy, they could afford to pay for portraiture. And analysis of this historical portraiture of these black African families shows that without any inbreeding with the local white European population, these black Africans became Mediterraneans. And it only took 4 to 5 generations. The wide, flat noses of the sort of African faces that their forebears had arrived with extended and became aquiline. The dark brown skin of the natural African mellowed into a Mediterranean olive. And after 4 or 5 generations, the portraiture of these families are indistinguishable from the background population. So, first of all, this suggests that through these temporary switches on the phenotype with these less well-defined codons, that the human organism that has enabled significant population bases everywhere from the North and South Poles, well, I don't know about the South Pole, but certainly the South Pole, from both poles to the baking heat of the equator. So I would suggest that all of the necessary code to facilitate that adaptation is actually hardwired into all of the DNA of all of the people on the Earth, and it's simply a matter of whichever phenotype they're subject to will dictate how their offspring will end up appearing. So anyway, there's a little introduction into the sort of genetic basis of why bifurcation, but we'll go into the sort of evolutionary part of it next. A bit more Jack Outerworld for you. This is another one particularly apt for this evening's subject. This is the rant.
Okay, I wanted to talk about the whole, do you want to be a crazy or do you want to be a clone? You know, because let's get right down to it. Let's cut through the shit. There are two kinds of people in the world. People who see things our way and people who are clueless. And you can apply this to anyone, and that's not even half as militant as it sounds. But it's like there's people who understand what's really going on, you know, that the government's corrupt, that there was no plane that hit the Pentagon, you know, they know the truth about, you know, they can't prove it, they can't point to it, but they generally know the direction. Yeah, they know the government's totally fucking corrupt. And they're trying to do what they can under the system so we don't all wind up in camps. You know, Sean, that's crazy talk. No, that's not crazy talk, because go take a look at the new major prison complex. If that's not an Americanized, bigger, better, you know, concentration camp, I don't know what is. To be honest, when you look at the whole structure we have now, you can either be a clone or you can be a crazy. And you got to make a choice at some point about whether or not you're going to fit in, because I got to tell you, there's a lot of benefits to fitting in. You know, Jesus. I mean, if looking back now, if I thought to myself, you know, Sean, fuck this, man, just walk away. You know, just comb your hair, and you know, just Jesus. You know, just go along with the Bible stuff for a while. You know, just go with it. You meet a nice girl there, and pretty soon you're believing it. You know, you're doing all right. Get a nice little job, be a bricklayer, be a grandfather. You know, crank out a whole shitload of pups, and you know, die. That's your life. Boom. And then you know, you think about that, and you go, that's pretty preferable, because every day when you're labeled a nut, or you try to be an individual or autistic, it's a trial. Every day, you know, you get up and you got a fresh set of new issues because you don't fit in, and people are afraid of you, and maybe they're interested in you, or they want something from you, or it's bizarre. And God help you if you get a little bit of notoriety too, because then you get people who follow you around and stuff and think that you're cool, and they want pictures taken with you and stuff, which is all right. I mean, I wouldn't mind at all. I mean, I'd like to have my picture with Christopher Lee. That'd be Chris. If you ever get a chance to watch this, baby, I'll do anything you want. Would you work with us? But no, seriously, like there's all kinds of people who I respect who are entertainers, and I'd have my photo taken with them. But it's like people make you into an icon, and then pretty quick you're believing your own bullshit too. Pretty quick I'm sitting there thinking, I really am the fucking man. Look at me, I'm the shit, right? But the reality of it is it's all just kind of a myth. not real. And to a lot of you who see that, they'll be like, whoa, what do you mean? Maybe not a lot of you, maybe I'm being generous, maybe a few of you might feel that way. But everything is like that, you know? Marilyn Manson's just a guy. And if you met him, you'd be like, well, there he is. He's long black hair. He's got 2 arms, 2 legs. And when you start to realize that, and those kind of bubbles get burst, you know, where Britney Spears is going to be forgotten, she's already being forgotten, it'll be the next teen superstar. It's going to come to the point where everyone's going to start to go a little bit crazy because we all realize the bullshit. And everyone's going to realize that they should start being individuals. I mean, with the internet, you know, luckily I hung around with those radical loner types. There's an awful lot of loners out there, you know. All the terrorists are loners. Everyone's a loner. All those protesters, they're all loners. 5,000-6,000 loners down there marching and holding hands and stuff. All loners. Yeah. Eventually, right now in your life, you may feel that you're, you know, pretty beat on. You know, you might feel like you haven't got a lot of friends, and the people you have are kind of online, and sometimes it gets scary at night, and you wonder, shit, man, what if they're all right? What if I'm just this big geek loser? What if I'm a freak? When that happens, you must realize that you're only a freak right now. And the younger you are, and the quicker you feel that way, the more people will be like you when you're, well, my age. You see, everybody's slowly going bonkers. Everyone's slowly going mad. And this crazed youth with steel in their face and tattoos and all that stuff, well, that's those are all the crazies. They were driven crazy. Their families were taken away from them by corporations. They were enslaved. They took all their time. No time left for the children, so they went insane. Me, you know, I'm probably one of those insane kids too, but I guess I'm probably a try-by philosopher type, and hopefully I'm the ones who are into me, you know, just in case you're ever wondering, you know, the WOG thing, we don't hurt people. Guideline 1. I mean, we don't hurt people. That's not in the rule book. Hurting people is a horrible, horrible thing. Violence to defend yourself is a completely different thing than hurting people. Hurting people is a direct thing. The WOGs don't. You understand what I'm saying here? It's the intent of the statement. We just don't hurt people. So, moving back to the crazies. The crazies on the whole have been driven crazy, and this is what all these kids are, and all of you who are watching, probably fans of mine, are mostly all the WOGs are probably considered batshit bonkers. I mean, seriously, if you would call yourself a WOG right now and say, yeah, I'm a WOG, how many people could you point to who would say, yeah, I could see that guy being insane? Remember Dave? Dave sitting there watching me going, yeah, I could be a WOG. You walk around his neighborhood. Do you think Dave might be nuts? Well, yeah, probably. You know, he spends a lot of time on the computer, you know. You know, that's the kind of shit you get. So gradually, take heart, you know. If you're feeling bad because you're feeling like you might actually be loony, no, everybody's going loony, man. It's not just you. That's why, you know, people weblog. It's very, very apparent. So coming back right the way around there, the clones or the crazies, it's better probably to be an individual because the clones aren't really a culture. They're fake. They're produced things. The Britney Spears, the Brady Bunch, you know, 90210, all that shit. It's all absolutely fake. It never existed. The Cosby Show. He's a comedian. It never existed. None of it's real. We're the reality. This is where the metal meets the meat. This is where it ends. I decide whether or not I'm going to murder this cow and eat it, bathe in its blood. I will decide whether or not I will graze upon the foliage. I decide, me. Further to that, I decide what I can and cannot put into my body, what I can and cannot put into my mind. But for some reason, we deny ourselves that basic right, that basic fundamental right. I always feel drawn to the television. These attackers, you know, these assassins, you know, merchants of destruction who are slowly strangling everything it is to be human. You know, they're closing in on us. So, nature, in its natural wonder, has decided to bring about something like me somewhere down the pipe and all the WOGs. And we're sort of a bit of a kickback for that. So, once again, clone or crazy. Everybody is crazy. Some of them don't know it. The people who are in denial of the fact that they're absolutely loony are the clones. You see them everywhere. They live in fear. It's a horrible state to be in. I wouldn't want to do it myself. But that's just me. You know? My name's Sean Kennedy. And I am the fucking man.
The wonderful Jack Outerworld and the quantum singularity there with the rant. So where am I going now? So we've covered. Yeah, just a quick thank you to I think it was I Am in the chat. Yes, of course, epigenetics. Yes, absolutely upholds the argument that phenotype is by far the. Well, I mean, just to cover the easy way of understanding phenotype over genotype rather than genotype over phenotype is, as an argument, is place two identical, genetically identical seeds into two identical pots and water them until the seed germinates. Grow them out until they're reasonably vibrant seedlings and then continue to water one while withdrawing water from the other. see how long the one without water maintains its genotype, and see how long the phenotype pressure takes itself to express itself through that genome. So it's self-evident. I mean, there's been some fairly interesting experiments done recently trying to prove that the Earth has always been the size that it is, and that giganticism in the historical epochs was simply down to oxygen levels. Just first of all, this is farcical. The experiment was based on fish, and with water oxygenation levels, the argument that oxygen levels on Earth ever were responsible for the giganticism in, dinosaurs and prehistoric insects, like 4-foot wingspan dragonflies, is just simply deluding themselves. The levels of oxygen in the atmosphere that they're having to postulate as the cause of this giganticism would cause forest fires all over the planet. That a forest, as soon as it started to dry out in that sort of oxygenated atmosphere, the first lightning bolt would have just lit the whole thing on the go, and it would have burnt like a piece of coal. And we see no evidence for that at all. In fact, if anything, the forestation was far thicker and more massive. I mean, it's not just the insect species as well. There's something that's still very common to this day called the horsetail fern. It was actually one of the first things that set me on my electrobiology route, was examining the horsetail fern. And I used to be into geology and mineralogy and all this sort of caper as a kid. Had like a fossil collection and that. And one thing that always used to astound me were these, what do they call them? The fossilised trees, the fossilised forests. They've got a particular bloody name and I can't think of it. No, anyway, can't think of it off the top of my head. But anyway, stacks of fossilised trees. And some of these mineralised, fossilised forest deposits are of horsetail ferns. Well, a horsetail fern in the current climate is something that will get to a maximum of maybe 5 or 6 feet in really ideal conditions, but that would have to be really swampy and particularly warm and quite bright, but not too bright, and all of this sort of caper. These things in like sort of the Precambrian or whatever it were like sort of 1.5 foot thick trunks and probably towering to 30 or 40 feet tall. Well, if you've ever seen a horsetail fern, it's basically just a bag of water. So it's incredibly hard to imagine how, and they are apparently under sort of microscopic analysis, to all intents and purposes, exactly the same plant. So why on earth would a horsetail fern that would tower to the size of a small oak tree or a beech tree, as a sort of single spike with little fronds poking out of it, as an incredibly primitive plant? Horsetail ferns were one of the first plants to develop axial symmetry, which is something that virtually all plants thereafter come from. So that's the reason why I was fascinated by that particular little plant. Right, I'm meandering a bit here. I really must stay on topic. Right, so so essentially there is an obvious link between the conditions an organism develops and lives under and its effect on the offspring of that organism. Now, when you look at the slow rate of transition in the natural world, nothing particularly happens very fast. Obviously, there are natural catastrophes, I suppose, that would be sudden, one-off events. But by far, generally speaking, those sort of events, apart from killing, a number of species locally directly influenced by it, they have the tendency to just simply push biology to either side until the event has concluded, and then biology simply rushes back in and takes over the territory as damn quick as it possibly can. Yeah, so essentially everything happens in nature at a graduated pace, at a fairly even progression, and that even with this even progression, given the sort of eons of time, we see this slow progression from one form to another that we now know as evolution. And it occurred to me many, many moons ago that the rapid change in human society, or at least in the fringes of human society, appeared to be something more than just a political or social movement. That many of the people that I found from spending a life within those fringes of human society had an entirely different outlook, a different way of seeing things to the rest of humanity. And then as the years went on and I got to the age where we start to pop out kids and our mates are popping out kids, and I became progressively more and more aware that virtually all of the people that I knew through this sort of underground community, their children were different. It's hard to define, but if you were to take a group of these children and place them into a population, you know what I mean, place them into a playground and segregate the children down the sort of underground parents and the non-underground parents into sort of two separate groups, I would suggest that anybody would actually be able to identify which group was which without needing to be told. Now, it's very hard to define that. It may be the way that their parents dressed them, maybe it was the fact that they'd often leave their hair longer than their other children. But, I mean, the majority of these kids were coming out like these blonde-haired, blue-eyed, sort of Aryan, you know what I mean, Aryan eugenicists' wet dream children, you know what I mean? They couldn't have designed a breeding program better to pop these things out more perfect. But often they wouldn't come from sort of blonde, blue-eyed parents, and often they wouldn't stay blonde-haired and blue-eyed for long into their sort of childhood. Often they would get dark hair. And funnily enough, that's exactly how I was. I was born more or less blonde, and within 3 or 4 years I went to the black hair that I still keep to this day. I suppose what I'm presenting here, what some people familiar with my work may be familiar with as my concept of homo novo, of this zebras and donkeys bifurcation of the human species into two more or less identical subgenuses. And it may well even be extremely likely that the physiological, the external morphogenetic differences are going to be less self-evident in this bifurcation process, and that in fact the thing that's evolving is perhaps the society around which the true despeciation will sort of nucleate. And so what may be happening is we may be seeing a transition event here, that we're moving into a period of two parallel streams of humanity. The reason why I use zebras and donkeys as an example is that effectively they are the same species. They're both equus, and despite having different Latin names, their genus, I think it is the subgenus or whatever it is, are different. This doesn't actually truly conform to strict species categories, simply because for something to be a genuine different species, then there can be no possibility of interbreeding. So that's not actually true with zebras and donkeys. They can interbreed. However, it, generally speaking, only ever happens in captive environments where the breeding stock is very limited between the two herds. Wherever there's wild donkeys and wild zebras, interbreeding is almost unheard of. And I would suggest that the reason for this is that while, a donkey on estrus and a zebra on estrus to a zebra or a donkey male is going to smell more or less identical, it's the behavioural traits of the two animals that's very different. Donkeys are very placid and docile by their nature, whereas zebras are very aggressive and very boisterous by their nature. And so it's not a physiological boundary between the sort of intermarriage of zebras and donkeys. It's a sociological boundary. It's a behaviourological boundary. Anyway, that's the sort of first postulate of this as a hypothesis. So let's raise the vibrations around here. Tricky there and Black Steel, originally a Public Enemy tune, that one. Teacup refilled. Let's go again. So we've kind of covered an outline of how it's possible that the human organism can vary significantly within its current single species form. However, I began to suggest that the phenotype environment that the human organism finds itself in the 21st century is so radically different to that of our parents' phenotype. And when we go back to our grandparents' phenotype, don't even go there, completely different world. Great-grandparents, now we're starting to look at Industrial Revolution era, certainly the tail end of the Industrial Revolution era, and bear in mind that even by the end of the Industrial Revolution, the vast majority of Englishmen would never have travelled within further than 20 miles of their homes between being born and dying. So the world that our children are being brought up in, and the worlds that we grew up in, and those of our parents, are on a graph with an exponent, a logarithmic scale. And even on a logarithmic scale, it's still a very, very steep line. It's my suggestion that rapid a change to the phenotype environment will predispose certain variations, and indeed I suspect that only a particular type of person is going to thrive and succeed. Isn't really a word that I suppose succeed to reproduce at some point in their lives. Yeah, so I was seeing all of these extraordinary children being born unto others, and then came of age myself and had my first son born, and so was, and especially me and my first boy's mum separated shortly after he was born, and I ended up with primary custody of him for several years, and so me and my boy were closer than most fathers and young babies normally get. And as a consequence, I had the opportunity to study this thing, this new organism in the world, with an incredible intensity. And I was fascinated by this thing that had come into the world. And the sort of more that time went on, the more fascinating it became, because this sort of little baby appeared to have abilities that weren't common to other babies of his age, and I'd been an uncle several times over by the time I had my first child, and so I was very familiar with lots of babies and had seen them grow up and knew what they were like and knew where their sort of various developmental stages were. And these children just seemed to be able to step outside of this, and my boy was by no way an exception in any way amongst my peers. All of the children that were being born to all of my friends at the time had this same strange, extraordinary quality about them. they would have a maturity that was uncommon to their age. So at a very early age, they would have grasp of sort of fundamental understandings about the world that were way beyond their early years and appeared to come from nowhere. And they seem to have an innate sort of affinity with animals of all sorts. A lot of them, I found, would often prefer vegetarian lifestyles or would seek out vegetarian food as a preference to meat. And again, this is I've been doing a lot of study of complexity in evolutionary systems and sort of the effect of complexity. And there's been quite a good study of sort of the human sort of evolutionary complexity path of complexity. And this one chap was suggesting that the various sort of stages of man since the sort of medieval times through the Renaissance and the Industrial Revolution and on to the sort of modern sort of global awareness has been essentially an expanding of the human sphere of compassion, the human sphere of awareness. Like I said, even right up to the end of the sort of industrial age, the sort of late Victorian times, it would be quite uncommon for somebody in a rural British town to have visited anywhere much further than sort of 20 miles away in their lifetime. So we've seen a rapid alteration in the stuff that makes us human. And I now suspect I first covered this subject in one of my first really early shows, 2011, I think, on TNS. In fact, I did a series on parallelism and bifurcation. That if this is happening, if we are seeing a despeciation or even just a division of humanity down some sort of sectarian lines that isn't arbitrary, that isn't being imposed from outside, that appears to be naturally devolved. And this is another thing, you know what I mean? We consider ourselves so abstracted from nature, but any statistical analysis of virtually anything human will reflect again this particular logarithmic curve, that when you study it statistically, this same logarithmic curve is everywhere in nature, and it's exactly the same bloody logarithmic curve wherever it's expressed. And that goes everywhere from number of heartbeats in a lifetime versus body size, or the size of the heart ventricle, or the number of neurons, and regardless of what scale of biology you take those measurements from, when you plot it onto a graph and compare it with all other known biology, you'll find that every single biological form follows this sort of hockey stick curve. And indeed, so the so-called Mars explorers were supposed to actually have this built into some of their detection code, that certain chemical signatures that indicate the presence of this sort of hockey stick exponential curve would have been one of their ways of detecting life on Mars before they actually managed to get a lander on there, supposedly. Allegedly. I've got people turning and froing here. Let me compose my thoughts here. I'm rambling a little. Need to focus, Jack. Focus. On a bit of this. Don't know what it is. The X-Lex there was crystallised. Okay, so Homo Novo. What does Homo Novo look like? Well, I've had enough of them through here to know what they bloody look like now. It's not really a matter of what they look like. It's a matter of their social structures. Their social structures are radically different even from their parents. I know a lot of their parents. And the social structures that they appear to be creating are much more fluid, much more dynamic, and appear to be based in a far more honour and trust oriented sort of societal key, and that any transgression of that is admonished, you know what I mean, sort of publicly. I hear the most fabulous sort of, not necessarily arguments, but if there's a disagreement amongst any of this group that I see tromping through here every bloody week. It's voiced almost immediately, and it's voiced publicly, and it's voiced honestly, and without malign intent. So generally speaking, as soon as it becomes an issue, there's no like sort of sitting on it for months and brooding. It's spoken about straight away, and usually sort of within a group structure. And this has the most incredible self-regulatory effect over the whole group. Yeah, so a level of self-organisation and coordination that was entirely absent from our generation, at least the generation that I was aware of. Anyway, I mean, first of all, this started way before I ever had kids, because I hung around with largely an older group of sort of hippies and bikers when I was kind of in my early teens and through into my 20s. And as a consequence, they were sort of popping out kids a long time before I was ever of that sort of age. And so when I first started to formulate this sort of as a theory, I just considered the couples that I knew and the lifestyles, or what I knew of it, and what I knew of, you know what I mean, sort of how lifestyle and diet and what have you could potentially impact on their offspring. And initially I kind of plumped for the hippie lifestyle, or something approximating the hippie lifestyle, as somehow being responsible. I mean, some of the differences that I noticed within their sort of phenotype envelope was probably a greater propensity towards herbs and spices in their foods, probably a greater than average propensity towards using the new sort of fruits and vegetables that were arriving in the newly created supermarkets. I mean, I remember the first supermarket going into Hornchurch Town Centre when I was growing up, and being fascinated by this concept of a shop with just boxes of things to sell, piles and piles of boxes. I think it was a Tesco's. And up until then, the only shop that I'd ever been in had a counter, and all of the stuff was behind the counter, and you asked for what you wanted and they handed it to you over the counter and you handed them the money. And the supermarket was an entirely alien concept to me. Where was I going with that? Oh God, I keep losing my train of thought. You really must excuse me. My nerves. Whenever it's a reflection of the more important. It's a like self-defeating bloody cycle. The more important the subject is to me, the more dearer it is, the nearer it is to my heart. The longer I put off doing a show about it because of its importance and because of my wanting to get it right. And then when finally I decide that I'm going to committing it to air once more, and like I say, this isn't the first airing of this subject by any means, on my behalf. The worse my nerves get. I mean, I'm bad enough for the hour, the afternoon, the day prior to opening the mic on a Thursday. But the more important the subject is, the worse my bloody nerves are. And I was terrible tonight. Really, really plagued by them. And while they have subsided while I've been on air, so I don't feel quite so traumatised as I did before I came on air, and still, I can't bloody think straight with this level of adrenaline. I've got so many things popping into my head, I can't even finish a sentence without some other idea having obstructed the thing that I was trying to think before. So our generation may well be the transition species, and our offspring may be the first generation of this Homo novo, or it may still be another 2 or 3 reproduction cycles down the road, and a lot more pressure from the phenotype changes that we're going through at the moment. But certainly something has happened, and there appears to be now a clear delineation, not only within the adult society. I mean, you hear a lot of people within the sort of alternative and truther scene, talking about waking up and the sheeple, and wake up the sheeple. And all of the people that I know that wouldn't necessarily describe themselves as awake or a truther or alternative in any way are, generally speaking, quite happy to be that way. They understand that there is that other sources of information exist, but they would rather not know. They're content within their reality bubble. Their life paradigm suits them well, and they will not thank you for disturbing it. And what I think is that they are the Homo sapiens, that they don't necessarily have the faculties with which to grapple with many of the subjects that we find ourselves routinely considering. And I would suggest that the majority of the listeners to this broadcast and to the podcast and to the YouTube will probably have found themselves considering and looking into subjects that, if they were to list them on a piece of paper and issue them to somebody of their predecessors' generation, they would probably presume that this person was slightly mad and would be concerned about their mental health. And it's simply because our generation already has made so much of a vault, so much of a quantum leap. I love quantum. So much of a phase boundary transition into some different state of oscillation that our lives are inconceivable to them. And there's enough of our generation that wouldn't be that unfamiliar to, that would not want to be considering the evolutionary segregation of humanity and what those socio-political consequences are likely to be. But for me, I'm surrounded by those homo novos, and I am fearful as to what society is going to try to do to them if they exhibit an extension of what appears to be the changes that appear to be occurring with our generation, or at least a portion of our generation. It's going to become more and more important, if I am right, that we begin to view the necessity for parallelism, that the sheeple, as some people would refer to them, but the Homo sapiens, the sapiens of this world, will want they're content with their government, they're content with their control systems. They don't really mind if their GPS location is tracked by their mobile phone company and kept on a record somewhere. It doesn't bother them. They have no reason to fear that. They have a belief in the system that they exist in, and it's not necessarily down to us to disturb that comfort, I suppose. So then what happens? So now we have two species equally as capable of physical violence, but we have one species, one genus, for whom physical violence and violent murderous atrocities has been its modus operandi for thousands of years, and serves it very nicely, thank you. I would suggest that one of the differences with Homo Novo is that very thought is inconceivable. I can't imagine of having to go to war. I suspect that if I were to believe sincerely that my country, that the borders of my own nation were imminently about to be invaded, I may be able to take arms to protect against a potentially aggressive opponent. But broadly speaking, the majority of the wars that England has been to fight, hardly in defence of the realm, is it? And it's just I can't imagine being a soldier and being sent to go and shoot and kill others. Go and shoot them, they're other. It's them that's the bad people. Go and shoot them and kill them, because that will make you good. inconceivable. And all of these kids through here all feel that too. I would be very surprised if any of them would have even conceived of a career in the army, which was something that was a career path for most of my peers of my generation. Even a preferred career path. So, we're different. Now, we can either skulk in the shadows and never exhibit our difference in public, but I would suggest that is where, a lot of the psychological disorders that we're currently seeing supposed sort of rises in probably arise from, is that if this is happening and we have handfuls of novos being sporadically born into and being immersed by sapiens society with all of its belligerent, warlike, aggressive prerequisites, that it's hardly surprising that those novos struggle to find a happy life and to maintain their sanity when they are expected to conform to a society that is entirely defined to satisfy those that are not of their genus, that are not of their subspecies. And there's going to be all sorts of other differences, you know what I mean? I would suggest that in these days of carbon footprint as being the sort of political meme, that there's also a social footprint. And one of the things that I've definitely noticed about all of these sort of novo children is their self-reliance and their interdependence and their ability to support each other through their own social structures. And so I would suggest that the social footprint of a novo is going to be a much reduced thing, and as a consequence it's going to be very hard to conceive of a way that a novo is going to be happy to be taxed and expected to contribute to the same society that will support sapiens kind of less sustainable society and more dependent and less interdependent society. So so we need to wonder about what is going to happen to all of these children. I suspect that this may be the crest of a tidal wave. My suspicions are, and they really are only suspicions, and I've seen certain evidence that appears to refute it, so they really are very tentative. But I suspect that psychoactive substances have a part to play in this. Certainly they have a huge part to play in creating the social structures that appear to be the cauldron from which these novos appear to be emerging, even if only in the primary route, and that there appear to be novos springing up in the general population regardless of the type of parents that they sort of emerged from. So there may be an implication to the wide-scale consumption of psychoactive substances, be that from the sort of speed of the 60s to the LSD and the hashish of the 70s to the ecstasy and the designer drugs of the 80s and the 90s. Until the cocaine revolution of the noughties, where London, for the second year running, has now been the reigning cocaine capital of Europe, with the highest levels of cocaine remnants in the sewage system. Certainly surveys are now suggesting that there is virtually not a teenager in the country who has not tried altering their consciousness with something other than alcohol. And moreover, amongst these novos, the predilection towards alcohol that would be commonplace amongst a group of their peers in, say, the 70s or the 80s, just is completely absent. They don't drink. As a rule, they don't drink. There might be the odd occasion when there's a party and they may take some drink with them, but on almost every occasion the drinking has been nominal, and most of the sort of party consumption has been of sort of non-alcohol based psychoactive substances. And this can't not have an implication. It can't not have serious consequences when an entire population is so radically altering its conscious state on a regular basis. And bear in mind that these teenagers that we see those statistics of today, bear in mind they're going to be the parents of the next generation, and very, very shortly, if mine are anything to be, and they're heading towards that age now. I can't believe that they were babe in arms so very, very, such a very short time ago. Anyway, let's stick on a bit of Arlo, and I'll ruminate for a little while. I suppose this is an appropriate juncture, considering magistrates' courts and the likes are being considered in the chat, being discussed in the chat. One of the things that drove me to such firm conclusions about such sort of wide subject, I suppose, one of the sort of more telling personal observations of mine was that during the Birkenhead arrest the judge UK column, not UK column, what are they called? Anyway, Roger Hayes and that lot, and Norman Scarth, and who else was it? I can't remember all the cases that I was following, but essentially I had people getting into the courts for a whole bunch of fairly high profile cases over here, and managing to get audio recordings of each of these cases, and it got to the point where we were trying to do live broadcasts from inside court cases. We very nearly managed it, to the extent that at one court case they actually sent down a police wireless jamming van, which we'd seen previously at the student protests, that just shuts down any 3G or mobile signal within a fairly narrow range. And yeah, having set up this entire court for surveillance for us for the event, we got to about half an hour before the event was due to start, and radio knockout in the entire area. The real sort of telling point was in the sort of Liverpool and surrounding area courts. This became such it was obviously that the various courts were getting to hear about our various deviant activities, and they began to tighten up the security on the courts to the point where they moved the metal detector from the door to the courthouse, so you had to go through the metal detector before you went into the lobby and all the rest of it, to the doors of the actual court chambers themselves. And before anybody could go in or out of the court, they had to sort of empty their pockets of all of their possessions and go through one of these bloody metal detectors. And it was only a very short sort of while into this sort of process that I began to hear back on the grapevine that the sort of the feeling in the magistrates' court certainly had turned from one of sort of mild support for what we were doing to one of almost utter resentment, because we had the damn gall to prevent people or slow them down in their attending the court to pay their bloody speeding fine or to answer their council tax summons or whatever. And it's just absolutely convinced me that, you know what I mean, should we ever try to shut down the court system or retake Parliament or anything like that, it will be us as a very small mob confronted by the vast mass of the society that we actually live in, trying to prevent us in our desire to you know what I mean, put things right as we see it. And this is the problem, is that we appear to have, as a cultural group, as a subset of the mainstream society, we appear to have a completely different mindset, a different outlook. And if you go deeply enough into many of these subjects, certainly as deeply as I have, and I know as Churchhead has, you end up with almost a completely different set of eyes. You see the world entirely differently to the way that your peers do, and to the extent that it begins to become very difficult to maintain any sort of normal human sort of communication standards between you and anybody that isn't part of this thing, this novo thing, whatever it is. I really don't think our generation aren't the novos. I think that we may be the parents of the novos. It seems to be our children, and it may be just that this is a historical thing, that all parents have viewed their children as this marvellous thing, but it's too widespread. I'm seeing this happening across the world, and even my kids are connected with people all around the planet of all sorts of varying sort of youth ages, and they all report back exactly the same vibe going on wherever these people are. You know what I mean? They've got mates in Sweden and bloody Japan and all over the place. My oldest boy as well, he's travelled the world. He's got fairly wealthy aunts and uncles on his dad's side. He's my stepboy. And he's even dined with the Bin Ladens, which is really peculiar. Not with Osama's side of the family, with the oil-rich side of the family. And he's saying that, yeah, even the sort of teenage children of these rich oil sheikhs were totally tuned in to what was going on in London and Manchester and Birmingham and Liverpool and New York and Hong Kong and... You know what I mean? This is a global effect. This isn't just some local effect. Yes, and this isn't a white European thing either. This appears to be happening across the races. There's another incredible statistic that's been, I wouldn't necessarily say it's been suppressed, but isn't necessarily, that everybody isn't necessarily aware of it, and that's the global reduction in crime rates. I remember there was a law minister, I can't remember the minister in charge of policing and all of that sort of Home Office, is that him? Whatever, anyway, who apparently was flustered about some police budget or other during the Thatcher era, and it got onto the public record that one of his aides was overheard whispering into his ear that it didn't matter what they did with the police budget, whether they raised it or lowered it, it was completely, had no impact at all on the crime statistics. And that this is borne out by this drastic, decade by decade, global reduction in general rates of, it's especially crimes of violence, the usual sort of, fights and murders and rapes and things. And essentially, regardless of the political doctrine of the countries, it's happening in dictatorships as the same as in republics and democracies, if you can find a genuine republic. But yeah, 10% every decade. And it's been falling for the last sort of 25 years. And nobody really knows why. And I would suggest that the reason why is Homo Novo. But we'll see. So if this is a tidal wave of new humanity, of Homo Novo, about to break, it's about to break just as Sapiens has effectively used up all of its resources. We are rapidly approaching an energy cliff. I mean, really rapidly approaching an energy cliff. There's certain encouraging trends currently, which is one of the things that I'm pursuing with this LED technology, is that it might be possible in certain areas to be able to technologically bypass the worst of the cliff, that the cliff becomes a graduated slope as long as our consumption can be reduced to match the reduction in availability, and that is, I think, still doable. The third report to the Club of Rome, Council of Committee of 300 in 2004, wasn't as encouraging. It was their third report. The preceding two had outlined what was about to happen. The second one outlined what needed to be done immediately and was pointing out how little had been done since their first report. And the third report was basically, well, guys, you screwed it. Too late, you run out of energy. But that was in 2004. And I know that sitting as I suppose a correspondent of these sort of scientific natures of the time, I was conversant in what was expected of technology of that day, and while the sort of wilder futuristic estimates have always remained wild and futuristic, and that seems to be a common theme, the actual advances in technology have been so spectacular and so unexpected, and many of them really like sort of almost like they were meant to happen. These things have been so synchronous, you know what I mean? There's been various, one that I often quote is the minus 60 degree superconductor, which was considered to be the sort of theoretical maximum, that it wasn't possible to make us anything superconductive above minus 60 degrees centigrade. And 6 different papers were submitted on the same day simultaneously to various publication houses declaring laboratory experimental research that had indicated materials capable of in excess of minus 60 degree superconductivity. And to the extent that one of the Chinese papers, the Chinese University Research Group, didn't have any access to telephones even to be able to send a fax over. They were so rural, and so they had to put their scientific paper onto a push-bike courier, and apparently it had taken him 6 days to ride from the university to the nearest publication office, and that still arrived on exactly the same day as the other 5 submissions to the other offices. So some things just, it's this hockey stick, this exponential curve. We are nature. We try to convince ourselves that somehow we've mastered nature and stepped outside of it, and there's this demarcation line between nature and this thing called human. We're just termites in a mound, and everything that we're doing is natural, which means that the internet is natural. It means that nuclear power stations are natural. It even means that the atom bomb was natural, if it existed. That takes a bit of getting your head around. But when you look around you at nature, nature is hardly a 24-hour party relaxation special. I mean, the majority of organisms that emerge into life may expect to see a certain lifespan, which will be an average that will be sufficient for them to meet their reproductive requirements and consumption requirements, respiration requirements. But that's about it. You know what I mean? There's no guarantees in nature, and we think that we've insulated ourselves so well, and really it's a very thin veneer that makes us look so insulated. Really, there's not that much of a difference. So essentially, if we have Novo and Sapiens coexisting, and things are beginning to get rough in the Sapiens world, there's a few options a few possible routes of action that are likely to be followed, I would suggest that sapiens' natural predilection towards violence is likely to drive them towards violence rather than resilience and inventiveness, adaptation. But I think that this has been so blatantly disregarded. I think that the implications of the energy cliff are so inconceivable to anybody that isn't novo enough, let's say, that they just simply can't consider it. So it's very much a head in the sand thing. It may be the reason why the wealthy appear to be on such a huge asset grab at the minute, is that they may know, you know what I mean, from their sort of more private pipelines, that some of this stuff is coming down the pipe at them. But this is so very imminent that I think that this isn't something that we're going to be looking at happening in 50 years' time or 60 years' time or 100 years' time. I think this is something we could be seeing in the next 5 to 10 years. And if that's the case, then really we're going to be seeing novo youth being expected to go off to war to fight for sapiens' resources. Now this shit gets serious. Now we have a whole different problem on our hands. Now, we can either wait till that issue arises and hope that we can navigate it somehow sociably and collectively and communally, but somehow I fear that that would not be the case. So for my part, I've made it my raison d'etre, my dharma, as it were, to try and make sure that all of these novos that I see, wherever I see them, whether it be in the street or coming through my front door, that they are as well equipped with the psychological adaptivity in order to be able to inspire and possibly to direct, to adopt leadership roles in crisis situations, with as many tools that they can become familiarised with, both physical sort of mechanical tools, the old tools of our generation, but also the tools of the next generation of computing. They've got to be computer literate. They've got to be encouraged to be more computer literate probably than they currently are. You know what I mean? The fact that they can play an Xbox game is not computer literacy. Being able to choose between square, triangle, cross or circle is not any degree of literacy in anything. I've been rabbiting away for most part of 2 hours. I might just stretch into the Omniversity with this. Let me put on another tune and just consider where I could probably do a rounding this up, if nothing else. So I'm going to preamble into Omni territory, at least. I mean, this is quite an Omni subject anyway, but it's a bit too hypothetical for most of the stuff that I try to present on Omni. But anyway. Yeah, I'm going to round up here. I'm happy that this has got aired again. Like I say, this is something that, you know, I mean, right back to my earlier shows, 2011, I first sort of went public with this hypothesis. And if I had been a sociologist or a social scientist, I may well have attempted to derive some sort of statistical evidence for my hypothesis. But I'm not, and I haven't. But what I do have is the witness of my own eyes and the sort of keen observation of humanity. I've always been one of those slightly creepy people that sit in the background at parties and watch everyone. Not because I'm slightly creepy and like watching people for any nefarious reasons, just that people fascinate me. Their interactions, their nuances, their social interplay. And I'd often felt such a kindred spirit with the likes of sort of your David Bowies and your Dave Byrne from the Talking Heads, and these sort of characters from sort of mainstream culture that appeared to view humanity as like a benign alien, viewing them from some lofty position. And that was often how I would feel in social situations, that I was watching some other race, not my own. This only strengthened over the years, and I now legitimately feel that I see enough evidence to really start to hammer this home, and I can't think of anything worse than Sapiens versus Novo war, or even a Sapiens versus Novo subjugation, where one feels it's in any way superior to the other and begins to try and, usurp the other, which may already, be the way that this works, maybe the masses are already Novos and the power elites are all just bloody Sapiens trying to maintain their archetypes of violence and control. Who knows? I'm going to blow out doing repeat for Omni tonight. I'm just going to play some tunes. The chat's full, and I don't want to empty it with my blah. Recycled blah anyway, because it never goes down that well. But I do have a new show, a new Omni, lined up, and it will be a corker if I can get around to finding time to do it. Today is my first day off, in inverted brackets, in inverted commas. For weeks I've been hammering away at this LED stuff. I finally got the first pre-production prototype finished and off to the client who's possibly going to be financing the first run. Last night, came home at midnight, 1 a.m. from a business meeting, go and do that stuff. So I really haven't had just even a half a shake of a lamb's tail to get around to doing more Omni stuff. Like I say, it's about a 40-hour process getting one Omni together and edited and scripted and all that. But I have got a cracker lined up, this whole complexity in biology issue. And its linearity and uniformity really is a subject that's fascinating me at the moment, and I'm finding a lot of really good info on it. So if I can hopefully find some way of getting that all downloaded and stacked up into an editor and edited down and scripted and all the rest of it, hopefully before next week, you may have a new Omni for next week. But anyway, in summation, let's look at the youth differently. The youth may well be the saviours of the adult population. They may well be evolving the adaptation needed, the adaptability. And just another quick thing that occurred to me as well, that with all of these sort of what I'm identifying as Novo youth that I'm seeing coming through this place, one key difference between sort of them and I would suggest the majority of the sort of mainstream population is with any of them you suggest to them that they are sovereign and they don't answer what, they say yes of course, and that the concept of individual personal sovereignty appears to be inherent, almost innate in them, and that this is something that appears to be driving a lot of their behaviour. So, maybe start talking to them as if they were your equals for a start, because that is a real big thing, is that these kids are coming through so mature that if you try to deal with them on an age-appropriate level, you will misjudge it hugely. You'll get it wrong. Just talk to them like they were you or me, and they'll get it, and they'll respect you for it. And the more we can garner the respect of those around us that we can see inheriting the same sort of trials and tribulations that we may have faced ourselves in our lives, being outsiders or different or part of some sort of underclass, that may well be the very guidance that they need to be able to navigate their way through their lives. Phew, I've done it. I'm not even sweating now. I could probably do hours now, quite easily. I'm not going to though. It's been too hard a week. Yeah, warming up to this a bit. Good to see so many in the chat. Thank you all for listening. Really encouraging to have numbers and sort of active interest in the chat, although I don't take an active part in the chat while I'm on air, just simply because I'm too easily distracted anyway to dare doing that sort of stuff. I always do check back in every time I've got a tune on and see what everyone's saying and that, and I always find it encouraging to see a lively chat and a full chat room, despite not being able to interact with it directly while I'm on air. Yeah, don't ask any questions in the chat. You might be better off PMing them to me or something. I might spot them that way. Anyway, thanks for listening. I'm going to stack up some more killer tunes for a couple of hours and kick back here, and we'll rock New Cross till the wee small hours. I hope you'll stay with us. Let's have a bit of Bjork and Human Behaviour. Rolls. Bye, folks.